It's not. It's tied. I need you to open the door. I'll tell you when you're outside the vehicle.
Open the door or we will break the window.
Okay.
Open the door or we will break the window. Your choice.
Temple, we've got a
I don't want to be
in a
aggressive. I'm
driveway.
just asking you to step out.
It's
You're not
running.
stepping out.
7 uncooperative sub.
The story begins not with flashing lights or a dramatic chase, but with something far more consequential: unchecked narrative momentum. A patrol officer arrives in response to a hit-and-run report, stepping into a neighborhood already saturated with suspicion, rumor, and long-standing grievances. From the very first moments, the investigation is shaped less by physical evidence and more by the emotional certainty of the complainants. What unfolds is a case study in how second-hand certainty, when left unchallenged, can harden into operational truth. The initial scene is calm on its surface. Residents recount a sequence of events involving a mailbox, a vehicle, and a familiar face. Their statements are confident, detailed, and delivered with a sense of exhaustion rather than panic. This is not presented as a mystery to them. The suspect's identity is treated as settled fact, reinforced by past encounters and neighborhood history. The officer listens, nods, and asks clarifying questions, but the underlying dynamic is already set. The investigation begins with a conclusion and works backward to justify it. Crucially, the officer does not witness the alleged collision. The damage is present, but the act itself exists only through civilian testimony. That distinction matters. In lawful policing, the absence of direct observation demands restraint and verification. Instead, the narrative accelerates. The suspect is described as habitually unlicensed, possibly intoxicated, and associated with drug activity. None of this is independently confirmed at the scene, yet each assertion adds weight to the perceived urgency. By the time the officer processes the physical mailbox damage, the case has already expanded far beyond a property offense. This expansion illustrates a common escalation pattern. When allegations stack quickly, the original legal threshold becomes obscured. A hit-and-run involving a mailbox is a low-level offense. But layered accusations, dangerous driving, substance use, trespassing, prior behavior transform the encounter psychologically into a high-risk pursuit of a dangerous individual. The law, however, does not escalate automatically with community fear. Reasonable suspicion and probable cause must be grounded in specific, articulable facts, not reputational momentum. The officer briefly locates a vehicle believed to belong to the suspect and initiates a pursuit. That pursuit is terminated by supervisory command, a moment that quietly but decisively shifts the balance of authority. The cancellation is framed as a safety decision. Traffic conditions, time of day, and the nature of the offense do not justify continued pursuit. This is a critical inflection point. Institutional policy intervenes, placing a boundary on individual initiative. The message is clear: whatever the officer believes about the suspect, the risk calculus does not support escalation. Yet the story does not de-escalate. Instead, it fragments. After the pursuit is called off, the officer returns to the neighborhood and resumes information gathering. Here, the investigation drifts further from objective verification and deeper into communal narrative reinforcement. Residents reiterate claims about the suspect's behavior, her lack of connection to the property, and her supposed warrants. The officer accepts these statements with minimal challenge, even as the legal implications grow more serious. The concept of a warrant, in particular, carries immense weight. An active warrant transforms an encounter from discretionary to mandatory enforcement. But at this stage, the existence of such a warrant is asserted socially, not confirmed procedurally. This is where authority subtly shifts. The officer is no longer simply responding to a report; he is now acting as the executor of a neighborhood's collective frustration. The goal moves from documenting an incident to preventing a person from returning. Residents are instructed to call emergency services if the suspect reappears, reinforcing the idea that her mere presence constitutes a threat. This instruction, while seemingly practical, blurs the line between lawful enforcement and informal banishment. Approximately 10 minutes later, the suspect's vehicle is located in a driveway. The officer initiates a direct command presence. This moment is pivotal because it represents the first face-to-face assertion of state authority against the suspect, absent any new offense observed in real time. The commands escalate quickly, and the suspect does not immediately comply. Whether due to confusion, impairment, defiance, or fear, the non-compliance triggers a familiar law enforcement script: repeated commands, increased volume, and narrowing options. The suspect flees again, and once more, the pursuit is terminated. This second cancellation compounds the earlier authority disruption. Each terminated pursuit reinforces a contradiction. The suspect is framed as dangerous enough to justify aggressive intervention, yet not dangerous enough to warrant continued pursuit under policy. This contradiction creates operational frustration, a psychological pressure cooker that will later influence tactical decisions. Hours pass. Time in policing can either cool tensions or sharpen resolve. In this case, it does the latter. When the suspect is finally located again in the same driveway, the context has shifted. The earlier narrative has had time to solidify internally. What was once a hit-and-run investigation now carries the weight of alleged fleeing, repeated non-compliance, and presumed warrant status. The officer is no longer encountering a suspect, he is confronting an unresolved challenge to authority. The interaction begins with commands to exit the vehicle. Nearby residents are present, introducing a public audience to the encounter. This matters. Policing scholars have long noted that the presence of third parties increases the likelihood of escalation, as officers become more conscious of perceived control and legitimacy. The officer instructs bystanders to retreat, citing safety concerns. At the same time, the suspect remains inside the vehicle, creating a static standoff. At this stage, the legal justification for forcibly removing the suspect hinges on several factors: confirmation of identity, verification of any warrants, and the lawfulness of the arrest itself. The dialogue suggests uncertainty. Officers discuss options, reference de-escalation, and attempt verbal compliance. Yet alongside this, contingency plans are articulated. Less lethal options are mentioned. The possibility of breaking the window is introduced. These are not neutral statements, they are signals. Each signal narrows the suspect's perceived choices and increases psychological pressure. The tension peaks in the moment selected as the opening hook. Within that brief window, authority crystallizes into ultimatum. The language shifts from persuasion to inevitability. The suspect is no longer being asked to comply, she is being informed of the consequences of continued non-compliance. This is the moment where the encounter becomes irreversible. Once the decision to forcibly enter the vehicle is articulated, the outcome is largely predetermined. What makes this moment so powerful is not the physical act that follows, but the accumulation that precedes it. Every earlier decision, accepting unverified claims, pursuing and then disengaging, instructing residents, returning hours later with unresolved authority, funnels into this narrow point. The officer's control has been challenged repeatedly, not by violence, but by absence, delay, and policy limits. The suspect, for her part, has learned that flight results in disengagement. Both sides are operating on reinforced patterns. When the window is breached and custody is taken, the encounter erupts into physical struggle. Pain is expressed, accusations are exchanged, and commands are shouted. From a legal perspective, this phase is often treated as a separate analysis: use of force, resistance, injury. But it cannot be meaningfully evaluated in isolation. The force used is the final expression of a process that began hours earlier with a mailbox and a story. This is where institutional accountability becomes complex. The suspect is ultimately charged with multiple offenses, including fleeing and resisting. On paper, the case appears straightforward. But bodycam footage exposes the invisible layers beneath those charges. It reveals how discretionary choices, narrative acceptance, and policy interruptions shape outcomes long before handcuffs are applied. The central question of this case is not whether the suspect should have complied. Compliance is always the safest option in theory, but legality does not hinge on ideal behavior. The question is whether each escalation was necessary, proportionate, and grounded in verified authority. When officers act on assumptions about warrants, intoxication, or criminal history, they risk converting uncertainty into force. Equally important is the role of supervision. The repeated termination of pursuits signals an awareness of risk, yet no alternative strategy is clearly implemented. There is no coordinated containment, no delayed warrant confirmation before re-engagement, no clear reset of the encounter's legal basis. Instead, the officer returns alone to resolve what has become, in effect, a personal enforcement objective. This is not misconduct born of malice, but of structural gaps. Unclear handoffs, incomplete verification, and the psychological toll of unresolved authority challenges. By the end of Part 1, the trajectory is clear. A minor property incident has evolved into a high-stakes arrest marked by force and injury. Not because of a single bad decision, but because of many small ones, each defensible in isolation, but collectively destabilizing. The bodycam does not show a villain or a hero. It shows a system struggling to reconcile community pressure, officer discretion, and policy constraints in real time. In the next part, the focus will narrow further, examining the precise legal thresholds at play during the standoff and arrest, and how misalignment between perceived authority and actual authority fuels escalation. By the time officers return to the driveway hours later, the encounter is no longer anchored to the original offense. Legally, this matters. Psychologically, it matters even more. What was once an investigation into a hit-and-run has transformed into an effort to reassert control over a situation that has repeatedly slipped beyond immediate authority. This is where policing often becomes most dangerous, not at the moment of the alleged crime, but at the moment officers attempt to close a loop that policy, circumstance, and time have left open. The suspect is located in her vehicle, stationary. There is no active driving, no fresh collision, no visible threat to others at that exact moment. This distinction is critical. Lawful police authority does not persist indefinitely simply because a person was previously suspected of wrongdoing. Officers must rely on present, articulable justification for detention and arrest. In this case, that justification appears to rest on a combination of identity confirmation, alleged fleeing earlier in the day, and the asserted existence of warrants. Here, uncertainty becomes the dominant force. Officers issue commands for the suspect to exit the vehicle, but their internal communication reveals ambiguity. There are discussions about de-escalation, about waiting, about alternative options. This is not the posture of officers executing a clearly defined arrest based on confirmed information. It is the posture of officers managing a problem they believe must be resolved, even as the legal foundation remains unsettled. The suspect's refusal to immediately comply is treated as resistance, but resistance alone does not retroactively justify an arrest. This is a subtle but vital point. Under constitutional standards, an arrest must be lawful at its inception. Non-compliance does not cure an unlawful detention, it compounds it. The footage shows officers oscillating between patience and pressure, attempting to coax compliance while simultaneously preparing for forced entry. This dual approach sends mixed signals, both to the suspect and within the team. As the standoff continues, the presence of bystanders heightens the stakes. Officers direct neighbors to retreat, citing safety concerns. This is a reasonable step, but it also signals that officers anticipate escalation. Once escalation is anticipated, it often becomes self-fulfilling. Tools are readied, roles are assigned, and verbal warnings shift from informative to coercive. The encounter narrows into a binary outcome: compliance or force. The invocation of less lethal options is particularly revealing. Less lethal tools are designed to bridge gaps where force may be necessary, but deadly force is not justified. However, their mere mention marks a threshold crossing. At that point, the officer has implicitly concluded that verbal resolution is unlikely. The suspect, hearing this, is faced with a shrinking window of perceived autonomy. Her action-style clothing, moving slowly, failing to unlock the door are interpreted not as hesitation, but as defiance. This is where escalation psychology takes hold. Officers interpret delay as manipulation. The suspect likely experiences commands as overwhelming and threatening. Each side reads the other through a lens shaped by earlier events. For the officers, this individual has fled twice and ignored commands. For the suspect, officers have pursued, disengaged, returned, and now threaten force. Trust is absent on both sides. Legally, the key issue at this stage is whether officers possessed confirmed probable cause for arrest. The dialogue suggests reliance on information from another officer, indicating arrest authority, yet there is no clear articulation of the underlying basis. Probable cause cannot be a rumor, nor can it be assumed based on community assertions. It must be specific, verified, and communicated clearly among officers. When probable cause is treated as implicit rather than explicit, tactical decisions rest on unstable ground. The ultimatum to break the window crystallizes this instability. Breaking a vehicle window is not a neutral act, it is a use of force that must be justified by necessity. Courts routinely scrutinize whether officers exhausted reasonable alternatives and whether the suspect posed an immediate threat. In this moment, the justification appears to hinge on non-compliance alone. There is no indication of a weapon, no active attempt to flee, no imminent danger to others. The urgency is procedural, not situational. Once the window is breached and the door opened, the encounter shifts into physical control. Pain compliance techniques are used, commands are shouted, and the suspect vocalizes distress. From a policy standpoint, this phase is often defended as a natural consequence of resistance. But resistance itself cannot be evaluated without context. If the initial attempt to remove the suspect was not legally sound, then resistance becomes a foreseeable reaction rather than an independent offense. The suspect's accusations-claiming officers are the real criminals, asserting the absence of a warrant are dismissed in the moment as emotional outbursts. Yet they reflect a deeper breakdown. The suspect does not understand why she is being arrested, and officers do not clearly explain it. Procedural justice research consistently shows that perceived fairness and clarity reduce resistance, even when outcomes are unfavorable. Here, clarity is absent, replaced by urgency. Another critical element is the involvement of multiple officers with varying levels of experience. Decisions such as who will break the window and how force will be applied are made rapidly. While teamwork is essential, diffusion of responsibility can also dilute individual accountability. When no single officer articulates, on camera, the precise legal basis for each action, post-incident review becomes fragmented. The suspect's complaints of pain and numbness introduce a medical dimension. Officers respond by instructing her to calm down, framing discomfort as a consequence of movement. While this may be tactically sound, it also illustrates how quickly a person transitions from subject to object in enforcement encounters. Once control is established, the narrative shifts from rights to compliance, from explanation to management. From an institutional perspective, this case highlights a recurring failure point: the gap between policy intent and street-level execution. Supervisors earlier demonstrated caution by terminating pursuits, yet that caution did not translate into a coherent follow-up strategy. There is no evidence of delayed warrant confirmation before re-engagement, no coordinated arrest plan involving additional resources, and no clear directive to disengage entirely until legal clarity was achieved. Instead, the responsibility to resolve the situation fell back onto the same officers who had already experienced repeated disengagements. This creates a psychological debt. Officers feel compelled to finish what was started, not out of vengeance, but out of a sense of duty and closure. However, policing driven by closure rather than legality is inherently risky. It prioritizes outcome over process, arrest over resolution. The bodycam captures this tension vividly. Officers are not acting recklessly, but they are acting under pressure created by unresolved authority. The charges that follow fleeing, resisting, hit-and-run reflect this layered escalation. Each charge is legally distinct, yet they are causally intertwined. The fleeing charges stem from pursuits that were terminated. The resisting charge stems from an arrest whose foundation is murky on camera. The hit-and-run remains the original catalyst, but it is now overshadowed by the conduct that followed. What emerges is not a story of a single bad arrest, but of compounding decisions made under uncertainty. Bodycam footage forces viewers to confront how easily enforcement drifts from evidence-based action to assumption-driven control. It also reveals how suspects, particularly those with chaotic lives or prior negative experiences, are ill-equipped to navigate such encounters calmly. As this part concludes, the core issue sharpens. Authority, when exercised without clarity, invites resistance. Resistance, when met without reflection, justifies force. This feedback loop is not accidental, it is structural. It thrives in environments where verification lags behind action and where policy boundaries interrupt without resolving. In the final part, the analysis will turn outward, examining the broader systemic lessons of this encounter, how similar patterns repeat across jurisdictions, how accountability mechanisms struggle to address cumulative escalation, and what this case reveals about the fragile balance between enforcement, discretion, and constitutional limits. The final chapter of this encounter does not end in the driveway where the arrest occurs. It continues in reports, charging decisions, internal reviews, and the quiet institutional acceptance of how events unfolded. Bodycam footage freezes a moment in time, but accountability lives in what happens after the camera stops recording. To understand the significance of this case, it must be situated within the broader system that allowed a minor property incident to evolve into a forceful arrest hours later. At the center of this case is the concept of authority persistence, the assumption that police authority, once initiated, remains valid until resolution. In reality, lawful authority is situational and time-bound. The original Hitandron allegation justified an investigation, not an indefinite enforcement mandate. When pursuits were terminated, that authority was not reinforced with alternative legal steps such as warrant confirmation, evidence preservation, or delayed arrest planning. Instead, authority lingered in an unresolved state, carried forward by memory rather than documentation. This lingering authority is dangerous because it feels legitimate to officers while remaining legally fragile. From the officer's perspective, the suspect had already fled, ignored commands, and disrupted the neighborhood. From a constitutional perspective, each new contact required fresh justification. The gap between those perspectives is where escalation thrives. The system offers few tools to reconcile them in real time. The role of community influence is also central. Neighbors repeatedly frame the suspect as a persistent threat, emphasizing drug use, trespassing, and instability. While community input is valuable, it is not evidence. When officers rely heavily on neighbor narratives without verification, they risk becoming enforcers of social order rather than law. This is particularly problematic in marginalized or chaotic environments, where informal reputations often substitute for formal records. In this case, community pressure subtly reshaped enforcement priorities. The objective shifted from addressing a specific offense to removing a person perceived as disruptive. This shift is rarely acknowledged explicitly, yet it is visible in the language used and the instructions given. Telling residents to quietly call emergency services if the suspect returns transforms police from neutral responders into agents of exclusion. The suspect's mere presence becomes criminalized by context rather than conduct. Institutionally, this raises difficult questions. Police are tasked with maintaining public safety, but safety is not synonymous with comfort. Discomfort caused by an individual's behavior does not automatically justify enforcement action. When agencies fail to clearly delineate this boundary, officers are left to navigate it alone, often defaulting to control-based solutions. The repeated termination of pursuits highlights another systemic tension: policy versus practice. Supervisors correctly identified that the risks of pursuit outweighed the benefits given the offense severity and environmental conditions. However, policy did not provide a clear alternative pathway. Termination without resolution leaves officers in a limbo state, expected to disengage, yet still responsible for addressing community concerns. This ambiguity fosters improvisation, which in turn increases legal risk. Improvisation is evident in the final arrest. Officers referenced arrest authority based on inter-officer communication, yet the foundation of that authority is never clearly articulated on camera. This lack of articulation matters. Courts and review boards rely heavily on contemporaneous explanations to assess reasonableness. When justification is assumed rather than stated, it weakens the institutional defense of the action, regardless of outcome. The suspect's experience further illustrates the human cost of such ambiguity. From her perspective, police engagement was inconsistent and unpredictable. She encountered officers who pursued and disengaged, commanded and withdrew, threatened and waited. By the time of the final standoff, compliance may have felt less like a legal obligation and more like surrender to an opaque process. While this does not excuse resistance, it contextualizes it. Resistance is often framed as a moral failing, but in enforcement analysis, it is better understood as a stress response. Unclear authority, perceived injustice, and escalating threats trigger fight-or-flight reactions. The bodycam captures these dynamics in real time. Officers escalating commands, the suspect delaying, both sides interpreting the other's behavior through adversarial lenses. Once this dynamic takes hold, de-escalation becomes exponentially more difficult. The use of force that follows is, in many ways, procedurally correct within departmental frameworks. Commands were issued, warnings were given, and force was applied incrementally. Yet procedural correctness does not guarantee constitutional soundness. The law evaluates not just how force is used, but why it becomes necessary. If necessity is manufactured through earlier missteps, later compliance with policy offers limited protection. Charging decisions further complicate accountability. The suspect faces multiple charges, each reinforcing the narrative of culpability. However, stacked charges can obscure causality. Fleeing becomes a felony because of earlier pursuits. Resisting becomes a charge because of an arrest that may itself be contested. This stacking effect often insulates initial decisions from scrutiny, as focus shifts to the suspect's final conduct rather than the process that produced it. From an institutional standpoint, the absence of visible corrective mechanisms is striking. There is no indication of supervisory debrief addressing the contradictions between pursuit termination and later arrest. There is no on-camera acknowledgement of uncertainty or recalibration. This silence suggests normalization. When ambiguous escalations produce arrests without immediate consequence, they become templates rather than cautionary tales. Bodycam technology was introduced to increase transparency, not merely to document compliance. Its value lies in revealing patterns that reports cannot capture: hesitation, tone shifts, assumption creep, and the emotional residue of unresolved encounters. This case exemplifies that value. It shows how officers acting in good faith can nonetheless drift into legally precarious territory when systems fail to provide clarity. The broader lesson is not that officers should disengage entirely in complex situations, nor that suspects bear no responsibility. It is that accountability must operate upstream. Waiting until force is used to evaluate reasonableness is too late. Agencies must scrutinize how authority is initiated, paused, resumed, and justified over time. They must train officers to recognize when an encounter has lost its legal anchor and require deliberate reset rather than persistence. This case also underscores the importance of temporal discipline in policing. Time can be an ally when used to verify information, secure warrants, and plan safe resolutions. Here, time instead hardened assumptions. Hours passed without new evidence, yet urgency increased. This inversion where time amplifies rather than diffuses tension is a systemic failure, not an individual one. In the end, the bodycam does not deliver a simple verdict. It presents a mosaic of small decisions, each understandable, collectively consequential. It challenges viewers to look beyond the final struggle and ask how inevitability was constructed. The suspect's arrest was not the result of a single moment of defiance, but of a process that steadily narrowed options for everyone involved. Accountability, in this context, is not about assigning blame after the fact. It is about recognizing patterns before they calcify into policy. It is about ensuring that when authority is exercised, it is clear, verified, and proportionate at every stage. Without that discipline, the line between enforcement and escalation will continue to blur, and bodycam footage will keep capturing the same story again and again under different names and addresses. This case ends where many do, with charges filed, reports written, and the system moving on. But the footage remains, offering an unfiltered record of how easily control can replace clarity, and how quickly a minor incident can spiral when authority is assumed rather than anchored.